In 2011, a group of economists in Italy did something unusual. Instead of studying the present, they went looking in the past, deep into the past, pulling tax records from Florence dating all the way back to 1427. 600 years of data. And when they matched those medieval records against the wealthiest households in modern Florence today, they found something that quietly broke their own assumptions. The names matched, not approximately, not sort of. The same family surnames sitting at the top of the wealth distribution in 15th century Florence are still, statistically, sitting at the top today. 600 years of plague, war, famine, revolution, the fall of empires, the invention of everything, and the same families came through all of it and landed, more or less, exactly where they started. Rich. So I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it before we go any further. What do those families know that the rest of us don't? And why has nobody ever explained it plainly? There's a story that gets told about wealth, and it's a story most of us find genuinely comforting. The idea is that money doesn't really stick. Fortunes rise and fall. The grandchildren blow what the grandparents built. There's even an old saying for it: shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. One generation earns it, the next coasts on it, the third loses it, and then the clock resets. Equal parts warning and reassurance. A reminder that no dynasty lasts forever, that the playing field, given enough time, eventually levels out. It's a beautiful story, and the data just doesn't support it. Study after study, across dozens of countries, across centuries of records, shows the same stubborn result. The single most reliable predictor of how wealthy you'll be in your lifetime isn't your education, your IQ, your work ethic, or the choices you make in your 20s. It's the wealth of the family you were born into. Full stop. The correlation is so strong, so persistent across so many generations that economists had to invent a phrase for it: intergenerational wealth persistence, which is a technical way of saying something much simpler and considerably more uncomfortable. Being born into money is, statistically, the most reliable path to staying in money. But here's the thing that explanation gets wrong, and this is where it actually gets interesting. It's not just the money that passes down. If it were just money, the shirt sleeve story would be true. One reckless heir, one failed business, one generation that just didn't care, and it's gone. We've all seen what happens when pure cash lands in unprepared hands. Lottery winners who are broke within 5 years. Athletes and musicians who earned hundreds of millions and ended up with nothing. The money alone doesn't explain the Florence families. Something else is holding the whole thing together. Something that survives bad markets and bad heirs and centuries of chaos. That's what I want to show you. The first thing you notice when you study old money closely is that it operates on a completely different clock. Most of us think about money in months. Can I cover this month? What does my account look like before the next paycheck? Maybe if we're being disciplined and optimistic, we think in years. Save for a house by 35, retire by 60. A decade feels like a long horizon to most people. It's not. It just feels that way because it's longer than most people plan. Wealthy families' real, generational wealth think in lifetimes. Not their own lifetime, their grandchildren's lifetime. The question isn't, what does this investment return in 5 years? The question is, what does this asset look like in 50? That single shift from personal timeline to dynastic timeline quietly changes every financial decision you make. It changes what you buy and what you refuse to sell. It changes your tolerance for short-term loss. It changes what you're willing to sacrifice today for people you haven't met yet. And it explains something that puzzled economists for a long time: why the genuinely wealthy so often seem willing to accept lower returns in exchange for stability. It looks irrational from the outside. From the inside, it makes perfect sense. They're not optimizing for this decade. They're optimizing for this century. Different game, longer runway, completely different math. Now, let's talk about the Rockefellers, because their story is the clearest example of everything I'm describing. And what happened to them should not have been possible. By the early 1900s, John D. Rockefeller had built Standard Oil into something the world had never quite seen: a monopoly so total, so suffocating, that it controlled roughly 90% of all oil refining in the United States. His personal fortune, adjusted for today, was somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 billion. Richer than any living person on Earth right now. Not close. Then in 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered Standard Oil broken apart, dismantled, split into 34 separate companies under antitrust law. The government had decided the empire was too powerful, and they took a hammer to it. By every reasonable expectation, that should have been the beginning of the end for the Rockefeller fortune. Instead, the family got richer. Because when Standard Oil shattered into 34 pieces, the Rockefellers owned shares in all 34. And those companies, freed to compete in an exploding market, collectively grew to be worth far more than the single monopoly ever was. What looked like destruction from the outside was actually multiplication. But here's the part most people miss: that outcome wasn't luck. It wasn't even strategic genius in the moment. It was the result of a structure the family had already built long before the crisis hit, specifically designed to protect and multiply wealth no matter what the world did to it. 3 pillars. And once you see them everywhere. The first pillar is structure. Wealthy families almost never hold their money in their own names. It lives inside trusts, foundations, family partnerships, holding companies, legal entities that exist separately from any individual person. Your personal name is exposed. Lawsuits can reach it. Divorce can split it. Bad decisions can drain it overnight. A trust can own assets for 100 years, governed by rules written by people who died before your parents were born, completely insulated from the chaos of any single generation's choices. This isn't exotic, it's architecture. The kind most people never build because nobody ever told them it was an option. The second pillar is financial culture, and this one is sneaky, because it doesn't look like education. It doesn't happen in classrooms. It happens at dinner tables. It happens in offhand comments and overheard conversations and the way adults in wealthy households talk about money when children are in the room. Kids who grow up in these environments absorb, before they're old enough to articulate it, a completely different relationship with wealth. They learn that money is something you steward, not just something you spend. That assets matter more than income. That ownership is the point. By the time they're adults, they've had 2 decades of informal financial formation that most people never receive at any point in their entire lives. The third pillar is the network. And this is the one that's hardest to see from the outside, which is probably why it's the most underestimated. Wealthy families don't just pass down money, they pass down rooms. The school their children attend isn't just education, it's a room full of the people who will run companies and funds and governments 30 years from now. The family's advisors aren't just professionals, they're relationships cultivated over decades that open doors before those doors ever appear in any public listing. Opportunities flow through these networks the way water flows through pipes, invisibly, constantly, and only to the places the pipes already reach. If you're not connected to the pipe, you never even know the water exists. Here's what I want you to take from all of this, though, and I say this carefully because most financial content gets this part completely wrong. None of those 3 pillars requires generational wealth to begin building, not one of them. The time horizon costs nothing to change. Tonight, you can start asking different questions about every financial decision in front of you. Not just what does this do for me, but what does this make possible for the people who come after me? That question sounds abstract until you actually sit with it, and then it starts quietly reorganizing your priorities in ways that years of discipline-based motivation never quite managed to. Basic entity structures, simple trusts, LLCs, holding arrangements are more accessible than most people realize. Not free, not instant, but within reach of far more people than use them, because the awareness simply isn't there. And the network? It compounds exactly the same way money does. Start earlier than feels necessary. Invest in relationships before you need anything from them. Show up consistently in rooms where people who think differently than you already gather. The network that quietly changes your family's trajectory 30 years from now begins with a conversation you have this year. But I want to leave you with something that sits underneath all of the tactics, because I think the tactics are almost beside the point. Every culture in the world independently invented the shirt sleeve story. The Chinese version, from rice paddy to rice paddy in 3 generations. The Scottish version, the 4th generation eats what the 3rd generation saved. Lancashire in England had almost exactly the same saying. Different languages, different centuries, different continents, and they all arrived at the same warning. Which means the squandering of wealth across generations isn't a flaw in certain families. It's the default. It's what happens when money passes without the architecture and the mindset that originally built it. The families who broke that pattern, the ones who show up in Florence's tax records in 1427 and in Florence's wealth surveys today, didn't outlast 6 centuries by holding on to money tighter than everyone else. They outlasted it by changing how they thought about what wealth actually was. To them, it was never really theirs. It belonged to the family, to the future, to people they would never live long enough to meet. They were just the current stewards of something larger than themselves, and their job was to leave it stronger than they found it. That's a genuinely foreign idea in a culture built almost entirely around the individual. Your money, your success, your portfolio, your retirement. The dynasty mindset cuts directly against all of it. It asks you to measure your financial life not by what you accumulate, but by what you make inevitable for people who don't exist yet. Here's what quietly unsettles me about all of this. The gap between old money and everyone else isn't really a gap in resources. Not at the beginning. It's a gap in time horizon. In how many years ahead the people making decisions are willing to look. And the cruel irony is that the one thing the wealthy protect most carefully, more than the money itself, more than the assets, more than any trust structure, is this way of seeing time. Because once you see it, you start making completely different choices. And once enough generations make those choices in a row, the distance between where you started and where your family ends up becomes almost impossible to close from the outside. That's not a conspiracy. That's not fate. That's just compounding, applied to time instead of money, running for long enough that most people looking at the result can only see the gap, not the decades of small decisions that quietly built it.